We are now live. Don't admit anything your lawyer can't defend you for. How's everybody doing today? All good? We get to start a new book with this, or a new section of the book. It's a good area. Now, I don't have a list for you to start. Actually, I have a little bit of a story. And the story was inspired by Rebecca's question last week about what these broadcasts were called. You'd ask the question about what did they call them when it was on the radio? What was it? So I told you I'd go and look I did. And I found this little story. It was on cslewis.com. There's a website. It's called the official website of C.S. Lewis. Considering how long he's been dead, I don't know who's running it, but somebody official. Don't know. But this was a story written by William O'Flaherty. No idea who that is. The anniversary of Lewis's first broadcast talk. It says, if you lived in England in August of 41, you would have had a front row seat to a historic broadcast on the BBC. Beginning at 7:45 on August 6th, C.S. Lewis stepped up to the microphone for 15 minutes and gave his first talk on the radio. Right and Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe was the name of the series that had only 4 episodes planned. However, Lewis returned for a 5th program because of listeners responding with questions that he felt needed answering. If you know your Lewis history, then you know it didn't stop there. He delivered 3 more groups of talks before the end of World War II. The first 2 sets of broadcasts were released under the creative title of Broadcast Talks in the UK in 1942. In the US, they were published as The Case for Christianity in 1943. Eventually, they became available as part of a collection of all 4 series of radio addresses in the now classic Mere Christianity. This never would have happened if it weren't for James Welch, the director of religious broadcasting at the BBC. He had read Lewis's The Problem of Pain and wrote to him expressing how much he enjoyed the book. In the letter, he also asked Lewis if he would be willing to come speak on the radio. While Lewis was no fan of the radio, the fact that he could potentially reach 1 million people with it provided the necessary motivation for him. An interesting footnote here is the fact that Welch had never heard Lewis speak. I've worked professionally in radio, and it's unheard of to ask someone to talk on the radio if you don't know how he or she will sound. Of course, we all know that the risk was worth taking because Lewis had a great voice. Sadly, only one of 3 recordings from his final series survived. There are a few places online where you can hear this, but I created a special post that also provides additional information about that broadcast. This first talk from 1941 is now known as The Law of Human Nature, but when Lewis prepared it for the radio, it was called Common Decency. This shorter title comes from the script Lewis carefully planned in advance of his debut broadcast. However, when it was first released in broadcast talks, it didn't have either title, but was simply the first piece of the first part of that book. The second half of the book contained 5 talks from What Christians Believe, the follow-up group of broadcasts Lewis did in 1942. Now, this is the interesting part, some of what we'll deal with. Some may ask why Lewis began his debut broadcast the way he did, focusing on natural law. Lewis thought the audience of his day was so lacking in their knowledge of the Bible that they didn't believe in the assumptions the Bible made about morality. Therefore, Lewis decided he must make sure there was an understanding that right and wrong existed universally. Once this truth was established, he could deal with the issue of not living up to that standard and from where such a standard originated.
Very interesting.
I thought that was fascinating.
Thank you.
And the mere fact that I found it was even more
That's
amazing, because I had not found that the first time I was looking up some of this history. So, cslewis.com. all sorts of interesting information.
Yeah, say again, what was the first one called before he got out?
Well, it was Common Decency was the title he had given for it, for that first chapter, first set. I also thought it was interesting, the second part, that some objections, second argument that we had looked at, apparently that was last in the broadcast. He had done the 4 broadcasts, and he got so much mail and correspondence over the course of the 4 that he decided to go back and answer some of those questions. And he tells us in the prologue to the book that when he had put the book together, he had edited it, and it's not purely just broadcast, but there is some editing, but he tried to keep it as natural to the broadcast as humanly possible. So that was kind of fascinating to me, but kind of puts you in that world as you think about it. So today we get to move on from the first of the 5 arguments, or the first argument built upon those 5 assumptions that he had. What was the conclusion? What was the conclusion with those first 5? Right and wrong, a clue. Shoot. You have this every week. And some days the brain. Right and wrong is a clue to the meaning of the universe. There we go. What was the conclusion he came to at the end of those? At the end of those 5 chapters, he said, aha! Because of this, we know what?
It had to have come from a higher authority.
Yes, effectively that there is a God. You know, God with a little g at this point. No matter what you say, no matter where you come from, somebody has created something and he's trying to get through to us. That was kind of what he was, working his way to. Now, interestingly, what it says here is the reason he started with that was because he couldn't assume, and you can't assume either, that people just have this knowledge of the Bible and what it says, and that the Bible itself has assumptions built into it, of course, that God is God, he's the creator. And Lewis is saying, I got all sorts of people out there that don't have those assumptions. So to start by hitting them with, here's the Bible, here's the Bible, here's the Bible, and they'll say, so. So that's why he starts where he does. Now, with this, with Book 2, What Christians Believe, we're going to get into a little more discussion about distinctly Christian ideas. Things that will make the God of the Bible different from all of these other gods. Gods, little. I feel like I should have a capital G and a little g as I'm talking here and going back and forth. So why don't we open with a word of prayer? And then we will read his first section. Father, we thank you. We thank you as we get here to gather today, as we gather in fellowship, as we come together to read what our human minds have been able to put together about you. We are inspired by you. We live our lives within you, but we just ask you to bless us here. Let your Spirit guide us. Let us grow wise. Let us learn what you would have us to learn here. And just help us to understand how this helps us to talk with our neighbors. Please be with us this afternoon. Be with those who aren't here, those who may be traveling, and for those online that are joining us. Just bless us this afternoon. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'll turn on my happy little light to make my life easier. The first part of this section is called The Rival Conceptions of God. I've been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all those religions, even the queerest ones, contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them the most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does not mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, But of course, being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority who believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with the ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. Now I go on to the next big division. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. There are two very different ideas on this subject. One of them is the idea that he is beyond good and evil. We humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another, and that nothing could have been different. Consequently, these people think that long before you got anywhere near the divine point of view, the distinction would have disappeared altogether. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man. But you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. It all depends on the point of view. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel, and as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians. And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body. That the universe almost is God, so that if it did not exist, he would not exist either. And anything you find in the universe is a part of God. The Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture, and he does not die if his picture is destroyed. You may say, he's put a lot of himself into it, but you only mean that all its beauty and interest has come out of his head. His skill is not in the picture in the same way that it is in his head, or even in his hands. I expect you see how this difference between pantheists and Christians hangs together with the other one. If you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think some things really bad and God really good, then you cannot talk like that. You must believe that God is separate from the world and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, don't talk damn nonsense. for Christianity is a fighting religion. It thinks God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head, as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists very loudly on our putting them right again. And of course, that raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling that whatever you say, and however clever your arguments are, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? Aren't all your arguments simply a complicated attempt to avoid the obvious? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I, who was supposed to be a part of the show, find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my fancies. Thus, in the very act of trying to prove that God did not exist, in other words, that the whole of reality was senseless, I found I was forced to assume that one part of reality, namely my idea of justice, was full of sense. Consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as, if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. Welcome to philosophy. So, this chapter, in and of itself, following with C.S. Lewis, it's fairly easy to understand his arguments or see where he's going. It's not difficult in that sense. But this is probably one of the more philosophical chapters that he gets into, this idea of if there was no light and you were made without eyes, how would you ever know it was dark? Does a fish know that it's wet? The kind of things you think about when you're sitting by yourself in a comfy chair on a rainy day. So I'm going to point out a few things before we get into our questions, but I laughed. So, college, 30 years ago, I think, as I sit and think about this now. As a business student, eventual CPA, I took one class in philosophy. Just one. And even then, at the time, I think it had more to do with logic and rhetoric than it did with these other philosophical systems that we get into. So philosophy is not necessarily my strong suit. It's interesting. Some people dedicate their lives to it. That wasn't going to be me. 1 + 1 needed to equal 2. That's how my life worked. And the reason I say this is because in my little bit of quirks or just unknown things, if you look at the back of your sheet, and they did print both sides, he talks about one of the famous pantheists, this George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. talks about him being very involved in pantheistic thought. And I thought, let's go see what he believed, and maybe we can kind of put it in a nutshell, and that way you can carry this knowledge with you as we get into this chapter. So the first place I went is the resource of all human knowledge, Wikipedia, and said, okay, well, you tell me what's there. And this is the paragraph I took. Throughout his work, Hegel strove to address and correct the problematic dualisms of modern philosophy, Kantian and otherwise, typically by drawing upon the resources of ancient philosophy, particularly Aristotle. Hegel everywhere insists that reason and freedom are historical achievements, not natural givens. His dialectic speculative procedure is grounded in the principle of immanence, that is, in assessing claims always according to their own internal criteria. Taking skepticism seriously, he contends that we cannot presume any truths that have not passed the test of experience. Even the a priori categories of the logic must attain their verification in the natural world and the historic accomplishments of humankind. Yeah, word salad as far as I'm concerned at this point. I was like, okay, that didn't make my life any clearer. I read it over again, and I was like, well, I'd be able to simplify it for you guys. And I'm like, yeah, nope, not working. And I looked up all sorts of things. So I thought, okay, and as I say here, in case that isn't clear, I went over to Britannica. It's the website for Encyclopedia Britannica. They've just gone onto the web. You no longer get books, they're just on the web. I thought maybe they'll make my life better. Yeah. Not really. After working as a tutor, he was headmaster of the gymnasium at Nuremberg. He then taught principally at the University of Berlin. His work, following on that of Immanuel Kant, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, and F.W. Schelling, marks the pinnacle of post-Kantian German idealism. Inspired by Christian insights and possessing a fantastic fund of concrete knowledge, Hegel found a place for everything logical, natural, human, and divine, in a dialectical scheme that repeatedly swung from thesis to antithesis and back again to a higher and richer synthesis. His panoramic system engaged philosophy in the consideration of all the problems of history and culture, none of which could any longer be deemed foreign to its competence. At the same time, it deprived all the implicated elements and problems of their autonomy, reducing them to symbolic manifestations of the one process, that of the absolute spirit's quest for and conquest of its own self. His influence has been as fertile in the critical reactions he precipitated as in his positive impact. Anybody still getting it yet? Yeah. So basically, in my quest to make all things understandable for you guys, to help at least get us a little bit closer, yeah, I failed on that one. We're going to take Lewis's comment at face value that he had a pantheistic view of the universe. Now, for those of you that ever want to check this stuff further, I've not had time to read it. The Accessible Hegel, which I probably will read at some point. But more likely, what most of us need is Philosophy for Dummies, which had one paragraph in there about Hegel, and it didn't really make anything any clearer than what I had there. So I said, forget it. This was a little rabbit trail I went down on this one that I just decided was not getting us anywhere. So I tried. But the deeper, now what I did find is there is a connection, eventually Hegel's thoughts eventually led to Marx, who thinks that eventually Hegel had not gone far enough in his thinking, so in Marxist thinking it's even worse. So the big lesson I think we can take from him in particular is that, you know, those Germans of that time just ruined everything for everybody. The German philosophers caused all sorts of trouble that we're still working our way through. But anyway, just want to let you know I tried. I tried hard. Couldn't get there. If anybody knows a philosopher they'd like to bring in that they think could explain him to us, great. But in the meantime, we're going to stick with C.S. Lewis and what he was trying to talk to us about. So according to Lewis, when we start this chapter, how can we divide up? What's the first major division of people? When you talk about people and what kind of people they are, what's the first major division he says exists?
Whether you believe that there's a God or not.
Yep. Easy enough. People either say, yep, I believe there is God. Doesn't necessarily matter which kind. He's just saying either I believe in God or I don't. So he takes that and he points out a very interesting fact to us. And what is the distinction he makes between Christians and atheists? What do atheists have to believe?
They have to believe there's not a God.
They have to believe there's not a God, and therefore, because they believe there's not a God, what do they think about the other half of the world?
Oh, most of the people in the world are wrong.
Absolutely. Now, the question you have to ask yourself, is there such a thing as an inconsistent atheist? Sure. C.S. Lewis is talking in categories. He's talking in, logical categories. Are there inconsistent atheists in the world who won't look at you in the face and say, you're wrong? Sure. So, if you're ever talking with a friend who says they're an atheist, you say, well, you have to believe everybody's wrong. They're like, yeah, okay, fine. Fine. But the logical consistency that C.S. Lewis points out is for those who say there is no God. They have to believe all of those people are wrong. You, Hindus, Muslims, Mohammedans, Muslims, in case anybody was wondering or lost on that term, Jews, Wiccans, whatever, any of those people, they have to say absolutely they're all wrong. No such thing as a God. What does he say about Christians in comparison to that?
They don't have to believe that all the other religions are totally wrong.
Absolutely. He says there can be shades of truth. He's not saying, and let's be absolutely clear, he's not saying that they're all true. But he says you don't have to approach it as you are absolutely, completely, 100% wrong. You can have discussions.
In other words, with other people who believe in God as a Christian, you don't say, oh, you're in the same category, according to Lewis, with the atheists. We're all,
Right.
For the first category, we all believe there is a God. And then we'll take distinctions from there.
Absolutely. Yep. And we can talk through issues. Believe it or not, even Baptists might have a little bit of truth hidden in there somewhere.
Think?
Or the Methodists. Or, Lord forbid, the Catholics might have some truth hiding around in what they believe. And that's what Lewis is saying. And then going outside of that, people who outside of the immediate Christian religion, he says the Jews have some truth. Muslims have some truth. Not all, but some. It's this idea that naturally, if you recognize there is a God, there may be some ideas there. Mormons might have some truth. I've always sort of been jealous about the social aspects of the way they take care of one another and do things. It's like, oh, they've got some truth there. They are looking out for one another. All of those things, he's saying, if you're a Christian, you don't have to believe that everything they say is wrong. You've got freedom to discuss and to work at getting at truth. If you say there is no God, you're kind of If you want to think about this in terms of a flow chart, if you're a Christian, okay, we can go and have discussions about God and who he is and what his nature is. If you're talking with an atheist and they say there is no God, go back to chapter 1 and work your way back through chapters 1 through 5 again, because you're not going to get anywhere until we get to the point of we have an understanding that there is a God, and he's trying to communicate, and he's trying to get through to you. There is a right and wrong, and you know you haven't kept to what should be. That's why he goes through all that. The point was, in this discussion, it said he went through that because he knew that if he didn't start there, there's a whole lot of people in society that are just going to turn it off. If he did not start with this natural law approach, a lot of people just weren't going to listen. If you say, God said to do this, and they're going to be like, what God? Or where? So it's a very, very good point he makes. So we get to the point. We don't really follow the atheist track anymore. Now we're talking about God. He says now there are two other views now. If you believe in God, there's kind of two main views. One he called pantheism. Anybody want to take a shot at describing that one?
Sure.
Good old Paul. Got it. What do you think?
They believe in God as a part of the universe. Intermingled. If the universe wasn't here, God wouldn't be here. It's one and the same. It's almost one and the same.
Yes. Yes. I mean,
But
the easiest.
being is in the universe.
Yeah, so now we're getting into these thoughts about God, and basically it's like the big thing he points out is that if that is your belief, then there is no real discussion about right or wrong. There just is. And God is there. I thought it was interesting the way he talked about cancer. Somebody has cancer, they go in, have surgery performed, the cancer is excised, cut out. And he said, well, that's a good thing that happens and your life is saved. But then somebody who has a rival point of view that believes God is all in all and part of all says, how dare you touch that living cancer?
That's kind of what's going on today with a lot of people, though. It's my truth.
Yeah, my
It's
truth.
not an absolute truth, it's my truth.
Yeah, well, that is a huge, enormous distinction to understand.
And also, too, if you press the idea of God's sovereignty over all things too far, you can say, well, God allowed it, therefore I'm not going to touch it. Even though medically I may be trained to say, yeah, that is what I think it is. Probably ought to come out. But
Yep.
since God made it and allowed for it to be there, then whatever.
Yeah, we'll just let things happen. Yeah, that's sort of the passive view, I guess. God is so sovereign that I just don't do anything. I am the person who just sits back and just says, okay, God's going to do it, and I sit back and wait. Now, that is not the view, and we'll get to that in kind of the last question. I don't want to jump ahead here. But if pantheistic, it almost reduces God to nothingness. In a way, if God is everything, then God is nothing. How do you differentiate God from anything? God is this piece of paper.
But
God
as
is this book.
Christians, God is within all of his creation, but he's also separate.
Well, okay, so you're moving on to the next question. So you're dying to answer the next question. So what would be the Christian view?
That he's
Of who-
separate from his creation. He's made it. It's been made by, for, and through him. But he is still separate and above it.
God is not this microphone. God is not this Coke. God only knows God is not this Coke. Only humans could have come up with this. How does he describe it? What are one of the examples he uses to describe God's relationship with his creation?
The painter.
Okay. How?
You could say, well, in here he says you could say of the painter, the artist, he's put a lot of himself into the painting that he made, but it's a reflection of him. It has his mark on it, but he is still separate from the painting. He exists separate from the painting.
If the painting is destroyed, he still exists. It's one of the big things he said.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're not allowed to light painters on fire. They don't like that. You can light their paintings on fire, but you can't light the painters on fire.
Sometimes they do.
Yes, the Christian view of God says God created, and I didn't point out the scriptures I put in the beginning, but scripturally as Christians, we understand this because we look to things like Genesis 1:1. We're told that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. We don't say that he became. It says that he created, he spoke the words. Authors speak words, and what do you wind up with? Books. Lots and lots and lots of books, but you can't say the book is the author. John 1, to get into the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. God created. The Christian view of God says God made, but this is not God. People are made how? In the image of God. We can see God in one another because we carry his image. We carry attributes. We carry parts of him, but we are not God. Meaning we can love, we can create, we can do things that reflect God and who he is, but we are not God. So he's saying that the Christian view, as opposed to the pantheistic view, is no, we are a creation. It is not just enough to say, no, you can't do that because they are God or they carry God. No. We are a separate creation loved by God. It's gonna carry into other arguments later on in this chapter. His final sort of point, and actually I liked if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. It sort of gets into that idea of like God does, God exists, and you would just realize God is everywhere and you'd stop fighting against it. C.S. Lewis's response, the Christian replies, "Don't talk damn nonsense." My favorite, because he had to put a note at the bottom of the page. One listener complained of the word damned as frivolous swearing. But I mean exactly what I say. Nonsense that is damned is under God's curse and will, apart from God's grace, lead those who believe it to eternal death. He says, no. All of this stuff you say that God is there, don't touch, don't do. He said Christianity is a fighting religion. What's he talking about? Christianity is a fight. Has anybody ever told you you're a fighter? We're usually told not to fight. Turn the other cheek. But that could be an act of rebellion.
Constantly fighting evil.
Oh, man. Some of it we carry in ourselves. Sometimes we're, I say
It's the
sometimes.
evil we fight.
Yeah.
What's in ourselves.
Christianity is a fighting religion because we've been placed, we're here in a world that he created. Trying to be very careful because some of these arguments get into the next chapter. So I'm trying not to argue the next chapter before we finish up this chapter. That happens occasionally. That man is here, that man is part of this world, that evil exists, that justice exists, that right or wrong exists, and we struggle within that. Christianity is not looking to close its eyes and sit with its legs crossed and just meditate on the nicer things in life that hope that all of our vibrations get everything right and the world will be happy. When Christianity settles down, when Christianity gets quiet and gets into prayer, what is it doing?
It's interceding.
Interceding, it's working, it's talking, it's communicating with God. It is a very active prayer. What looks to the world like a very passive activity is one of the more active things you can do. We just had Pentecost. Jesus had ascended and he told the disciples to what?
Travel nations.
Well, yep, he did that, but at the time he also told them to go where?
To Jerusalem.
Out and preach.
Jerusalem. Yes, he does tell them to go out and preach, but he said, go to Jerusalem and
So wait for the
wait. That's not exactly the go get 'em start. We sit down, we as people have a desire to go, to do. We feel like we're not doing if we're not doing. How's that for a phrase? We're not doing if we're not doing. God said, go, wait, tarry in Jerusalem for a little while. I will bring you the power. I will bring you the ability to go and to fight. C.S. Lewis recognizes this, that is our struggle, that's where we're going, and that we are constantly going to struggle against the world that we live in because we know something is wrong. We know that it's not perfect. We know that it's not everything it ought to be. Now he talks about his conversion and how that really affected him. So for him, he really had to get himself out of this mindset of there is no God. And how did that argument go? Does anybody want to take a shot at the argument that he was making? He said, I don't believe there's a God. And what did he use to justify that thought?
He didn't show himself.
He doesn't show himself, but he very specifically talked about something at the end of this chapter. He did. He very, very specifically said that the universe was very unjust.
And then he realized
There was
that
suffering.
if he knew it was unjust, there had to be something to gauge that by.
Right.
That's back to the moral law.
It gets back to the moral law. And that changed his perspective. That changed the way he looked at it. How can you know if there is a right or wrong unless you know that there's a right to begin with? So we're struggling in a world that hasn't come to that realization. That's what he's pointing out here. We've got people with different ideas about God. Some just don't even believe, in which case we're going to take them back to the beginning and we're going to let them know other people think God is in everything, but that ultimately, if God is everything, then God is nothing. And then otherwise we're going to sit and we're going to talk about who God is, what he does, then we can get into more specifics. But that's where he's leaving it, is this idea that as Christians we struggle. This is one of our beliefs. We don't believe we're saved and we're just sitting off to the side waiting for the end of the world. Sometimes we do, but we shouldn't. It's not what God has us out here to do. So that is the first chapter of Book 2. Any questions on this one? How did we like to dive into deeper philosophy? Yeah, I could do without it myself. I prefer his way of just looking at step by step and walking us through it like we're little kids. I can live with that, but trying to dive headfirst into the deep end of the philosophical pool did me no good. Any other questions? I guess that was my question.
Where did he separate the big G God and the little G God?
Where did he separate?
Yeah.
Well, he's still working his way through. I would say this entire chapter is still kind of working its way through the little G God. We started the first 5 arguments, really got to the little G God and said, okay, there is a God in somewhere. And now he's into this idea of what Christians believe, but I believe he's still building that base. So we've got the flow chart now, we've got the atheists, okay. We've got here, what do these people believe? We've got the pantheists, and we've got those who believe in a God who created. But he hasn't really differentiated this God yet between the Jews, the Muslims, the Christians. That God is still little G God, if you will. I don't think until we get into discussion about personality, personhood, later on with God, that we will get to that explicit sort of differentiation to Jesus and the cross and God. Make sense? I think we're still floating. And even though you and I as Christians looking at what he says, we understand where he's coming from the big G God perspective, I don't think he's there yet for the radio broadcast.
This is
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm so disappointed that as they said, only like 3 of the broadcasts even exist. Like you wouldn't be able to hear him speaking except on 3 of the later broadcasts, but a lot of stuff didn't get saved from that time. Any other questions? Yes.
Well, people, was Lewis's listening audience, would they have been better educated than we are today?
Everybody was better educated than we are today. I say that only semi-facetiously. Certainly those that followed a college track probably carried a better educational. We're talking the 40s. But even in the U.S., if you ever, so I don't know who wastes time on Facebook like I do, but every so often you see these things where they're like, well, here's an 8th grade test from 1880, would you have passed this 8th grade test? And you're looking at it thinking, I wouldn't have passed it when I was in college. So would they have necessarily have been smarter? Possibly in terms of just sheer education, but then also the educational divide might have been wider between those who went on to university and did studies versus those who worked factories, and plus bombs were falling on their heads.
Was there any indication that his broadcast got a bigger audience as they went along?
I don't know. I do not know. They were publishing the books pretty early, so I think he got that kind of audience. It seemed to me in the 40s they had already started publishing the books.
Yeah, but he was doing it during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're in the bomb shelters, maybe they had no choice. Maybe they just But that, you know,
captive audience.
Came through the speakers, and
Yeah.
that's what you got.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know about the personalized. I haven't seen any personal experiences of those who were listening at the time. I had one other thought, and it cleared out of my brain. I'm sure it was really, really good. Well, if I think of it, I will save it for next week. Why don't we close up with a word of prayer? And we'll end things. Father, we thank you. Thank you for giving us this time together to read, to think, to use our brains, and really just stretch our minds. Walk with us this week as we prepare for worship on Sunday. Be with us as we enjoy the weather and the weekend. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.